So chapter 4 is going to be our first step here into looking at organic molecules. And an organic molecule is something that contains carbon. So eventually you might take organic chemistry, which is going to be the study or the chemistry of compounds that contain carbon. Organic molecules can be really simple, like this one right here. It looks like we've got a carbon, some hydrogen, maybe an oxygen, and a nitrogen there. Carbon molecules can also be extremely large. So some of the largest proteins and molecules in our body are made up of a carbon skeleton or backbone. And carbon is really unique because of its ability to make 4 bonds. So it has 4 electrons in its valence shell, and thus it has 4 pairs of electrons to share. And so it makes 4 bonds in this tetrahedral shape. And you can see kind of this one's coming out at you, whereas this one's going back into the screen a little bit. This one goes up, and then this one comes over. So you can build complex structures off of any of these 4 bonds, and then if you use another carbon, you've got a whole bunch more spaces to continue building large, complex, variable molecules. The only carbon-containing compound that's generally not considered organic is CO2, which is an atmospheric gas. So this is the only one that we don't generally consider organic, and then anything else that contains carbon is typically called an organic molecule. For life to have even evolved on Earth, there had to have been organic molecules in the very beginning. And you will go into a lot more about how life kind of started in biology too. But there was a famous researcher, his name was Stanley Miller, and he did experiments where he took the atmosphere of what it would have been like on early Earth. So he had methane gas, hydrogen gas, ammonium here. And what he did was he ran that through an experiment where he heated them up and then cooled it down. So this would have been to simulate something like being near a volcano or a lightning strike and then being cooled down. And when he selected his sample after he cooled it down, he was actually able to find organic molecules, including things like amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins. So once we realized that it was actually possible to take the atmosphere of early Earth and develop basic organic molecules, this began kind of the first stages in the study of the origin of life on Earth. Carbon is really awesome. Carbon has an atomic number of 6. So in the nucleus we have 6 protons. That means the first electron shell is going to have 2 electrons. And then the second electron shell has 1, 2, 3, 4. So that leaves 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces for carbon to be able to form a bond. And it does this in that tetrahedral shape. A carbon can form a bond up, down, and then one going back kind of into the board. And then this one is drawn kind of coming out at you. Right? And so these are a 3-dimensional shape that gives carbon structures a really large, complex 3-dimensional shape. When a carbon forms a double bond with another molecule, it actually strains 2 of these bonds and it has to form in the same plane here. So this is actually going to be a flat plane. It doesn't go like into or out of the screen. And so a double bond here is going to give something a different structure. So one way to change a structure from a molecule is to make a single bond into a double bond, and that is going to have a drastic effect on the shape of the structure. And what we know is that when you change the structure of a molecule, it's going to change the function of that molecule. It's also common that molecules on a single bond can kind of rotate, whereas around a double bond, this is not going to be able to rotate because there's 2 bonds here holding it in place. Here are a couple other 3D structures using carbon. So methane is CH4, so this has got 1 carbon and then 4 hydrogens, and you can see that tetrahedral shape. And then we've got ethane, which is C2H6, so you can see that there's a single carbon-to-carbon bond here, and this is able to rotate around this bond. So these can spin relative to the other carbon molecule. And you can see the 2 tetrahedral shapes here. And then ethene, E-N-E, means there's a double bond here. And so now you can see that this is all in one plane, and these two double bonds are actually strained and they're bent towards each other to hold these two carbons in place. So you can see the difference between the tetrahedral and the single plane. And if I tried to rotate this around, it wouldn't work because there's two bonds right there. So I'm not going to be able to rotate that carbon relative to this one. So carbon is often found paired with hydrogen. Most of the time, if you see a carbon structure drawn like this, we assume that the corners are all carbons. And then if you don't draw in any other molecules, you just assume that all of the other bonds are taken up by hydrogen. And for the most part, there's tons of hydrogens attached to carbons. But carbon can also bond with other things. So we can see carbon typically double bonding with oxygen. And this is because oxygen needs to form two bonds to share two electrons. And so it can do that with carbon. Sometimes carbon will bond with an oxygen, which also bonds with a hydrogen. And so you can see how oxygen is sharing the two electrons that it needs, right? 1, 2, one with carbon and one with hydrogen. Carbon also typically bonds with nitrogen, and then nitrogen often bonds with two other hydrogens to fill out its valence shell. So you can see nitrogen has 1, 2, 3 electrons to share. And so instead of forming triple bonds, nitrogen's typically only going to form single or double bonds. Nitrogen does form triple bonds with itself to make N2 gas, but if the double bond was strained, you can imagine that a triple bond is extremely strained. The shape of this molecule is very hard to maintain. The carbon backbone is called the carbon skeleton, and you can see the carbon skeletons highlighted in blue in all of these molecules. And carbon skeletons can vary in every way possible. They can vary in length, double bonds, branching, rings. All of these different things will give a molecule a different structure. So here we've got 2 carbons versus 3, and you can continue to add carbons to get these really, really, really long carbon chains, which are things that we're going to see in like fatty acids where they have really long carbon chains. We can also see that this is called 1-butene because this is on the 1, 2, 3, 4 carbon, and this is 2-butene because this is on the 1, 2 carbon. And the placement of the double bond is different. These molecules are almost exactly the same. They have the same number of carbons, the same number of hydrogens, but they have a different structure. And the placement of that double bond is going to affect how that molecule functions. These over here are also the same chemical formula, but different shapes. They both have 4 carbons and then 10 hydrogens. However, these are 4 carbons in a row, whereas over here you have 3 carbons in a row with 1 branching off. And so they end up having the same chemical formula. We could write them all as C4H10, but you wouldn't know which one you were talking about unless you looked at the actual 3D structure. And of course, the way that the 3D structure is arranged is going to affect how this molecule functions. When we have 6 carbons, they often form rings. So we can have hexane, which is carbons that are single bonded to each other, and then benzene. And so if you look, this benzene is typically going to be 6 carbons with 3 double bonds. This is actually going to make one flat plane. Because of all those double bonds, it doesn't really have much of a 3D shape. It's actually a 2D plane here. A hydrocarbon is an organic molecule that consists of carbon and hydrogen. And if not only those 2 molecules, then vast majority of the molecule is made up of hydrocarbon. So a lot of the organic molecules we're going to see, especially lipids like fats, have these large hydrocarbon components. So this is a fat droplet. This is the portion here is called a glycerol. And you can see those oxygens are in red. And then this entire thing right here, that's a fatty acid chain, and it's a hydrocarbon. And so you can see that the black molecules are the carbons, and then the gray ones over here are the hydrogens. And if you remember all the way back to talking about covalent bonds, this is a non-polar covalent bond. And so these are going to share their electrons about equally. And so that means that these are going to be hydrophobic, meaning that they are non-polar and they're not going to dissolve well in water. So things like fats and oils tend to be hydrophobic because they have these large hydrocarbon components. Hydrocarbons are also really awesome for storing large amounts of energy. It's a really, really dense way to store large amounts of energy. So this is how when we burn fat on our body, we use it for energy. Things like oil, gasoline that we use in our cars is also a large hydrocarbon. It's a source of energy. Whether it's the best source of energy for cars, that's debatable, but it does store large amounts of energy. And then in the combustion engine, that energy is released and used to power your car. All right, so an isomer is a compound with the same molecular formula, meaning that it has the same number of each atom in it, but a different structure and different properties. So this means it's going to have a different shape, and because it has a different shape, it's going to have different properties. And there are 3 different types of isomers. So the first is the structural isomer. So if you look at this, we can see that both of these molecules have the same number of carbons. They both have 5 carbons, and then they both have 12 hydrogens. So C5H12. So there's no difference in the chemical formula. And if I just wrote C5H12 on the screen and didn't give you the 2 structures here, you wouldn't know which one I was talking about. This one has 5 in a row, and then this one has 4 with a branching. So this is a structural isomer because they have the same chemical formula, but they have the different structure. A cis-trans isomer is going to be a special case of an isomer that is going to form around a double bond. And they typically have the same type of covalent bonds, but what's different is the spatial arrangement. So we can see the cis-trans isomer down here. And we have in the middle the carbon-to-carbon double bond. So that's the same on both of them. What's different is where the molecules are on the other side. So on this one, this is called the cis isomer. You have the X and the X. In this case, the X just means it's a variable group. It could be a functional group. It could be whatever. It's just not a hydrogen. They're on the same side. So cis means same. The way I remember this is just like talking about gender. So if somebody's gender assignment at birth and their gender identity are the same, that person is cis. And then trans is the opposite of this. So on the double bond, you can see how the X is over here and over here, and those are across. This is the trans. So the word trans actually means across. So we use this when we talk about gender identity as well. So a person whose gender assignment at birth and then gender identity are not the same would be considered trans. And then the last type of isomer is the enantiomer. And that's a mouthful, but what it does is it means it's mirror image. So if you take a second and look at your 2 hands, right? Hold your left hand and your right hand. They are mirror image to each other. So if you have them facing each other, the thumbs are on the same side, the pinkies are on the same side. But there's no way to lay your left hand palm up and your right hand palm up and match the fingers because they're mirror images. And so the same thing can go for molecules. So you can see right here that we've got 2 mirror image molecules facing each other. And there's no way to shift one of them to be the same as the other one because they're mirror image. So here are some examples of some enantiomers. Having the correct enantiomer is really important when it comes to drugs that we prescribe. So for example, here's ibuprofen. This is the pain-reducing drug. S is kind of the left-hand version, and then R is the right-hand version. And you can see that these are mirror images of each other. If this was a mirror, they would be exact copies. But the L or S ibuprofen is the only one that's effective. This one doesn't work. So when we have chemicals, we need to make sure it has enough of the effective enantiomer for it to be a functional drug. Same thing for albuterol. This is the one that would be in an inhaler for somebody who has asthma. And in this case, the R albuterol is the effective one, and the S albuterol is the ineffective one. So why is one effective and one is not? And it's because the specific shape of a molecule has to fit into the receptor molecules, the receiving proteins on our cells. So for albuterol, for this to actually affect our bronchial muscles, it has to actually interact with those cells. And the right albuterol does, and the S-albuterol doesn't, because the right albuterol physically fits, and the left albuterol does not. Think about if you were going to wear a pair of gloves. So I'm talking about like maybe leather gloves or fitted gloves that only fit on a certain hand. If you take a pair of left-hand gloves and you put them on your right hand, they don't fit right. And that's kind of what happens here. If you use the wrong enantiomer, it doesn't fit into the receptor correctly, and thus it's not going to work correctly.